The truth is costly, but the truth will set you free. Our presiding bishop, Bishop Michael Curry, has asked all of us Episcopalians across the nation today to ring a bell at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. So we will be doing that. We'll be ringing it at 12 o'clock, because that's roughly 3 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the first sale of men and women as slaves in the English colonies in North America. The truth is costly, but the truth will set you free. It was an English privateer ship sailing off the coast of Florida or the Carolinas, came across a Portuguese merchantman and captured 20 or so, we don't even know the exact number, but 20 or so men and women who had originally been kidnapped from their homes in West Africa and sailed across the Atlantic against their will, and presumably the Portuguese were going to sell them into slavery in either the Caribbean or South America, most especially Brazil, probably to work on sugar plantations. Hard work indeed, but very labor intensive. Well, they didn't reckon on coming across an English privateer ship who overcame them, and they took these men and women and sailed back to Virginia to, ironically, Comfort Point, where they unloaded everybody, and then they made their way to Fort Monroe, which is now a National Heritage Site in Virginia. And there, those men and women, their prisoners, were sold on the block to the highest bidder, and probably turned to working in the tobacco fields. Tobacco was grown in Virginia as a cash crop, and again, like sugar, was highly labor intensive. And so, yeah. And what began then was a long and tragic history, 250 years of slavery in North America. First the English colonies, and then what became the United States of America. It's estimated that over 600,000 people, men and women and children, were taken from their homes, mostly in West Africa, but also Central Africa, and sold into slavery in the English colonies. Perhaps upwards of 15 million people were forcibly transported against their will from the African continent to the Americas, to North and South America during the 250 years or so of the slave trade, and is probably the largest mass migration of humans in our history. 15 million people. 1 in 8, or sometimes 1 in 6 people died during the voyage, and so we really have no idea of the exact numbers. And it's created a trajectory which still lives with us today, doesn't it? Still lives with us today. I know these days it's almost unimaginable. I remember when my children were doing their social studies and first learned about slavery, my daughter especially said, "I can't understand how this could happen. How could people do this to other people?" I know today it seems almost impossible, and yet it is part of our history, our shared history. And so today, as Episcopalians, we will be remembering that day, that first fateful day, all those years ago, which still overshadows all of us, white and black, Native Americans, and everybody who has emigrated here. We all live with this history which has shaped so much of the culture and societal norms even in our own day. Oregon's history is slightly different, but nevertheless just as tragic and just as racist as any of the worst in the South. I remember the first time I visited Portland, Oregon, and it was so bizarre. It was like, where is everybody? Everybody is white here. Where is everybody else? I mean, I grew up in a big multicultural town just outside of London, and London is kind of a big melting pot, and living on the East Coast, of course, and then, so my first visit to Portland, Oregon, it was so bizarre. Everybody is pretty much white. Where is everybody else? Little did I know that fact wasn't just accident, it was by design. By design. When white settlers first came across the prairies and came into the Oregon Territory, they were determined that there would not be the development of large plantations worked by slaves as they had experienced in the South, not because they were particularly against slavery, but because they didn't want large plantations to undercut small farmers. And they knew that if people started to bring slaves to Oregon, that would undercut the farming industry here in Oregon. So from the very beginnings, African Americans were not welcome. In fact, the provisional legislature in 1857 passed a law that forbade African Americans to come to the Oregon Territory. If they did come to the Oregon Territory, they had 90 days in which to leave or suffer the consequences. If people brought African American slaves with them, they had 2 years in which to get rid of their male slaves and 3 years in which to get rid of their female slaves. When Oregon became a state in 1859, we were the only state in the Union to be admitted with a white-only policy. Oregon was founded as a state by white people for white people. And that trajectory has carried on through our history. In the early 1900s, Oregon and Portland in particular was the center of white supremacists. The KKK had, per capita, the highest membership in Oregon of any state in the Union. Governor Pierce, who was elected in 1922, was a prominent member of the KKK, and there were numerous members of both the Oregon Senate and legislature who were members of the Ku Klux Klan. And even into modern times, in the 80s and 90s, Portland actually became the center for a skinhead revival who were hoping that the Pacific Northwest would be the place to create a new, pure white homeland. And this is not a part of our history that is taught in our schools. I spoke to my kids about this, and they were like, yeah, we learned all about the pioneers and a little bit about the Native Americans, but nothing about our racist past, about our the exclusionary policies of our state legislature. The 15th Amendment, the one that enshrines equality under the law for everyone and secures voting rights for everyone, no matter what your color or origin or ethnicity. That was passed, of course, at the end of the Civil War. That was not ratified by the state of Oregon until 1959. 1959. And there were sunset laws in many towns and cities and communities across our state into the 60s and into the early 70s. Lake Oswego, I believe, was one of the last to formally take the sunset law clause, which meant that people of color were not allowed outside after dark until the very early 70s. Why am I bringing all this up? I mean, you know, some of you may be thinking, or I've thought, why rake all the past up? Shouldn't we just be leaving that behind us and moving on? Well, I think there are at least 3 reasons why we need to remember this history and keep telling the stories. First, to paraphrase poorly, Henry Ford, who was one of the supreme racists of his time. In fact, Adolf Hitler said, "I admire Henry Ford," but he did say, those who are ignorant of their history are doomed to repeat it. If we do not know our history, and if we do not know the truth, the real truth of our history, we are much more likely to fall into repeating it. The second reason why I think it is important to retell these stories, or maybe even tell them for the first time, because many of us are ignorant. No fault of our own, but we just weren't told for lots of different reasons. But it's important to tell these stories because the story of our past is the reason why we are where we are today. The reason why Portland is over 75% white, there's a reason for that. The reason why Oregon is so dominated by people from European heritage, there's a reason for that. We are here today because of the decisions made on our behalf years ago. We weren't a part of that, but we are collectively inheritors of that. And even today, it's not a level playing field. We know that. It is not a level playing field for young people of color growing up and people who are of European heritage growing up in our country. Difference in education, difference in opportunities, and just straight out racism on the street every day, which those of us who are white, we don't see it because we don't experience it. You know, as I've said before, white families do not have the conversation with their children, particularly with their boys, that African American families have to have with their children. It's called the talk, and it's about how to survive an encounter with the police. This is what you do. If you're pulled over or stopped by a police officer, this is what you do not to provoke a deadly incident. I teach my kids that the police are their friends and they're to help them. We live in a different culture, but it is the same streets. And the reason for that is because of our history. And we need to be aware of it, not for blame and judgment's sake, but so that we can be free of it. We can be free of it, which is the last point. My scripture is from the first letter of John. The truth is costly, but only the truth will set you free. The truth is costly. This is painful for all of us. Painful for all of us. And Bishop Michael Curry, his ancestors were sold as slaves and born in slavery. He has a different heritage in that story, but we all have a part in it, whether we were new immigrants like me or whether our family has been here for generations and generations. And only telling and hearing the truth of it will set us free, because I know in my heart that all of us want to walk into God's beautiful, loving vision for us, where all of us are free, where all of us are accorded the same respect and dignity, because we are all children of God. That's what we believe in. But we can only truly get there when we acknowledge where we have come from, when we hear the truth, even though it may be painful. So today, at the end of this service, we'll sing an African American spiritual, which we're trying not to be culturally appropriate, but I think it's important to remember. And then we will, those of us who can, will go into the courtyard and we will ring the bell for 1 minute. And we'll remember, we will commemorate, we will pray and ask for healing as we think about those 20 odd, as John Rolfe recorded, those 20 odd men and women brought against their will and sold. Amen.